Good evening, everybody. Hey, it's working. Right, we'll kick off. I know that there has been a train delayed, so there may be people coming in drips and drabs later on. My name's Rory Wood. I'm the High Street Heritage Action Zone Project Officer at Barrow Borough Council. We've organised this event this evening to look at setting up a heritage development trust for Barrow and South Cumbria, and I hope that the speakers tonight can help to demonstrate how that may be beneficial for the town and how community-led regeneration can really help the heritage assets at risk in the town and the rest of South Cumbria. So the speakers that we've got tonight are Annoushka Deighton from the Architectural Heritage Fund, who are a national funder, Stephen Anderson from Valley Heritage, who are a heritage development trust in Rossendale in Lancashire, and David Dawson from Safe Grange Lido, a local project which I hope you're all familiar with. So without further ado, let's kick off with the first talk from Annoushka.
Hello everyone, can you hear me there? Getting a bit short. So my name's Annoushka and I work for the Architectural Heritage Fund. And I'm going to talk to you first of all about the Architectural Heritage Fund and then a little bit about heritage development trusts. So the Architectural Heritage Fund are a national fund provider. We provide grants, loans and advice and support to organisations who want to take on empty heritage buildings in their community and repurpose them into something. And that something could be anything that is useful for the community and brings that building back to life. How I got involved in my job was through this building here. So this is Stretford Public Hall, and it's about 5 minutes away from where I live in Manchester. And if you've ever gone to Old Trafford or to the town centre, you'll come off the M60 and quite possibly have driven straight past it. So it was built right in the heart of the town and was used for 130 years as a community space for weddings, parties, that sort of thing. And then for about 50 years was home to a children's theatre. It was owned by the council. They used it for council offices for about 30 years before deciding to dispose of it. And this is where I stepped in. At this point, I'd had no background in heritage, knew nothing about owning buildings, looking after them, or setting up organisations. But myself and a couple of friends were really, really passionate about the potential of the building. We kind of walked into it one day and went, there's no way this can be lost. This can't be sold off to a property developer. It's got so much potential. And so we set up an organisation to save the building from being sold. Very quick story. We set up a campaign group. The council eventually came to our way of thinking that we were the best guardians for the building, and they sold it to us for £10. So we have now spent about the last 5 years turning it into a multi-purpose venue, and it's really changed the sort of heart of our centre of the town, because there was very little going on in Stretford. It was a bit run down, there's not much pubs, there's not much nightlife, and people didn't really come there. They sort of saw it as a bit of a useless place to visit. And it's really helped change the face of that. We've turned it into a place where we have now art activities, we've got lots of wellbeing activities, we have dance and yoga, and half the building is taken up by a co-working space and artist studios, and it's really brought the building to life, but also attracted the interest of investors into the town. This was one of my favourites, where we had the film Cars showing. We got the children to make their own little cars out of cardboard boxes beforehand. So we've set up a community choir and got the youth theatre up and running again. So there's been lots and lots of benefits for Stretford itself. And then on the back of this, I developed a love of heritage. I started visiting other projects and really falling in love with, what the potential of what buildings and what the meaning of those buildings to places could really do. And so I started work for the Architectural Heritage Fund. I'm sure a lot of you will be aware of this building. So this is just down the road up in Ulverston, Carrow Hall. And this was one of the first projects that I got involved with when I started working for the Architectural Heritage Fund. And there's a whole range of projects like this across the country, across the northwest, that we are involved with and we support. Norman Nicholson House is just up the road down in Millham, and this is a small building in Millham which local people have taken on, the Norman Nicholson Society. They've taken on the house that Norman Nicholson was born in and lived in, and they want to turn it into a museum and a cafe to support to sort of expand the knowledge of Norman Nicholson, as well as bringing people into the town. Morecambe Winter Gardens, just across the bay, another community-owned building that is groups of local volunteers doing a fantastic job at keeping that building up and going. And another one in Morecambe, this is the co-op building in West End. And it's a group of local artists who are turning it into a creative hub for creatives and small startups, and supporting local people in being able to bring benefits to the local area, as well as support those individuals in becoming better at managing their own businesses. This is a bit more close to me. I used to live opposite this, directly opposite it. Didn't even realise it was an old train station, just kind of saw it as an old cash and carry. When it came up for sale after being empty for decades, the local people decided to convert it back into a cafe, but also it opens up onto what is now a cycle path on the old train track, and they've opened it into a cycling hub and a beautiful cafe, and it's a stunning building inside. Their works have just been done. It should be open in about 3 months. I think that's them getting very excited with their paintbrushes last month. And so next one. Another one is where are we? Victoria Baths. This became quite well known as on the back of a TV programme called Restoration, and a group of local people turned the swimming baths into an arts centre, and it's been used for various things over the years. Another one up in the northwest, this is the Turkish baths in Carlisle, and a local group have just at the start of their journey here getting involved to see whether or not this currently local authority-owned building can be turned into a community-owned asset. So, the Architectural Heritage Fund and how we work. We provide a number of services to people thinking of taking on heritage assets. And we've realised that there's normally a project stage that a way that these projects develop in certain stages. And we've tried to break down the support we give to reflect those developments of those projects. So the first grants we offer are around project viability. And this is if you've got an idea or your heart set on a building, before you get too involved, before you actually sign on any dotted line, that you do some work around the viability of that project. You get architects involved and see, is this a building that can be repaired? If so, what are those costs? And whatever idea you have for that building, or several ideas, that you explore those ideas and see, if we do get this building up and running, can there be a business case to support that? Can this building be self-sustainable in the future? And is there a demand for what we think there is a demand for? So that's kind of an overview, just to get an idea, and hopefully at the end of the project viability, you produce a report that will be able to answer, in general terms, yes, this is worth exploring further, or let's leave it there, it's not going to work for whatever reason that might be. We then provide project development grants, and these are around the next stage. So in architectural terms, that's getting you up to about REBA stage 4. And for those of you that aren't in that field, that means getting you up to the point where you can tender for capital works. So you can work out exactly what the costs are, get all the structural reports done, get a QS to cost that up for you. So you've got a good idea what that will be, and you can go to builders and contractors and tender out the work. You can also take that work to capital funders and say, look, we've got a really good idea of what these costs are. We'll also support you around developing your governance of your organisation, making sure that you've got the right governance structure. That if you are a charity, that's going to work, or perhaps you'd be better off as a community benefit society or some other structure, but we can give you support and advice as well as money to get some further details about whether or not that works for what you want. We'll also allow you money towards building up that business case. So get professionals in, go and do a bit of peer visits, go and see what other projects are doing and see what's worked for them, and doing some marketing and market research to see if there's demand for it or if there's need for whatever it is you're providing. Now we can only offer this support to organisations that are not-for-profit. So it can't be to private individuals, it has to be not-for-profit organisations. And there's a wide range of those that we do support, but that's just something to bear into mind. There are a couple of other things we do. There's Community Shares Booster Programme we have currently, which is supporting, if you're doing a community share offer, we can provide some match funding for that. Also a crowdfunder, if you're doing crowdfunding, we can provide match for that if you have an ongoing project. And then again, we also just offer simple advice and support to people, and we do have a loans team who can provide loans for organisations who need it for their buildings. So, Heritage Development Trusts. This is a relatively new concept that has been brought forward by the Architectural Heritage Fund. And what it is, it's a model that's been developed through an organisation, and it can be many different types of organisation, that has a commitment of reimagining uses for heritage buildings in their community. And rather than just looking at one building, the idea is that Heritage Development Trust will look at a portfolio. They might start off with one building, but they will then use that building and the experience they've garnered from that to move on and take on other projects in the town. And they work really, really closely in partnership with the other stakeholders. So that be the local community, local authority, those other key providers in the town that are already working there, to make sure that they're working together, not duplicating work, but working alongside the existing structures that are in place to help improve the needs and demands that the local community may have. And once again, these will be not-for-profit. Now, the Heritage Development Trust doesn't have its own governance structure. You can't just be a Heritage Development Trust. You would also be a charity underneath, or you might be a community benefit society. It's not got a legal model of itself, so it kind of sits on top of another structure. And the Heritage Development Trust we have probably have as many structures as there are trusts. So this is the video. So hopefully this will be a video that will show a little bit more about what a Heritage Development Trust is.
Our high streets and common spaces face a moment of profound change. The era of identikit retail, focused on short-term profit, is coming to an end. Now we all face the daunting challenge of what comes next. But in towns and cities all over the country, an untapped power exists. The buildings that tell the story of our communities, those unique places of character and identity, could now help transform them. Unlocking this power is not simple or easy. It takes a special kind of partnership, with the right skills and motivation to make these projects work. Local people coming together with local government, businesses, charities and more. And there's a model for how to make it work. It's called a Heritage Development Trust. And they're already making an impact. In Great Yarmouth and in Coventry, in Sunderland and in Lancashire, pioneering people are using the HDT model to renew the places they live. What makes these trusts powerful is the way they work. Across multiple buildings, pooling expertise and resources, communities of entrepreneurs collaborating and innovating for the common good. Out of the old, new kinds of spaces are created, with the principles and long-term view to support a new generation of projects and businesses ready to reinvent our centres. Abandoned department stores can become hotbeds of culture and entertainment. Local people supported to revive and upgrade libraries for the future. And closed bank branches turned into affordable housing and community space. Just when it is needed most, this model can lay the foundations for a revival in our common spaces and breathe new life into local economies and communities, making every place somewhere we want to live and work. At AHF, we've seen the power and impact Heritage Development Trusts can have. We've backed the first few, and we're now supporting more. Our town and city centres are crucial to our prosperity and our health. Heritage Development Trusts can help create a new future for them and the historic buildings at their heart all over the country. Join us in making that a reality, in building a better future from our past.
So as you can see from the videos, we've got 3 more Heritage Development Trusts that have been built up since then, and they are all over across the country. Interestingly, quite a few of them are coastal. And there's just been a bit of thought about what HDT can do. So just one of them, Great Yarmouth, which was previously a Buildings Preservation Trust, has worked out that it's brought in £8.4 million worth of work. 17 projects have been completed through them. They've provided 25,000 hours of training, and they've provided 25 residential units. And just a quick word at the end. So AHF are one of the funders, but none of these projects are funded alone by just one funder. This is just some of the projects that were involved, some of the grant funders that were involved with Stretford Public Hall. And, sort of gone are the days of going to one funder and getting a massive grant. You're much more likely to get a hodgepodge of grants, loans, and we had community share offer. There's lots of different ways to raise finance. And I think organisations are becoming much more aware that you need to be more flexible and resilient, and the idea that at the end of it you need a sustainable business model that can help ensure that a project can move forward in the future without necessarily relying entirely on grant funding. So I think I'm going to end there, and I think we're having questions at the end, so thanks everyone.
Okay, thank you very much, Annoushka, for that talk. Next up, it will be Stephen Anderson from Valley Heritage.
Good evening, I'm Steve Anderson. I am the chair of a heritage development trust called Valley Heritage. We're based in Rosendale in Pennine, Lancashire, which who knows, some of you may have passed through at some point in the past. And I think if you'd have been watching that video, hopefully that building is familiar to you. It's quite slick, that video. I've forgotten how good it was. So yeah, got to follow that now. That's got to be tough, isn't it? Next slide. So I think this evening, I guess there's a few aims really. I thought one of them is to talk about Heritage Development Trusts as a model, how they work, and I think I can hopefully exemplify a little bit of that from the overview that Annoushka gave, and hopefully also talk a little bit about some interesting projects and hopefully leave you walking away a little bit inspired about what the community can do with these heritage assets if it pulls together and kind of works on them. So I'll go through a little bit about who we are, I'll talk a little bit about Heritage Development Trusts, and I'll talk about the project that we're working on at the moment, and try and leave you with a few thoughts from Valley Heritage's experience over the last 6 or 7 years of how we found actually taking forward a HDT and taking forward projects. So who are Valley Heritage? So we are an organisation that's set up in 2015. We're a registered charity. We've got 5 trustees and quite a few volunteers. We work kind of across Rosendale and slowly but surely broadening our horizons out into more of Pennine, Lancashire, trying to basically reuse heritage assets for social benefit. And one of the statistics I'm kind of quite proud of, I suppose, is over that period of time, actually only since 2019, we've brought about £1.2 million into the local area, and that's been primarily focused in Bacup as a town, and we're beginning to see the impact of that investment now. So a little bit about our philosophy. So we love old buildings, we love historic environment, we're very passionate about it, and I'll, just to kind of say that passion extends into my professional life as well. I'm an architect specialising in historic buildings, including working within the Barrow High Street Heritage Action Zone, where we're one of the practice I work for, helping Rory and Helen, if she's around, to deliver that project. So I've had the pleasure of getting to know your town a little bit over the last few years, which has been fantastic. So in terms of that passion, we really kind of feel very strongly that heritage is part of our cultural legacy. You know, these buildings have got stories to tell, and if we can sustain those buildings and repurpose them where they've fallen out of use, then that cultural legacy gets sustained. And these spaces have the ability to be an anchor point within communities, you know, something familiar, something long-standing, something that can kind of inspire people, and we're very passionate about bringing all of that forward through the work that we do. So, in terms of heritage development trusts, so Valley Heritage set up as a traditional building preservation trust in 2015, and in about 2 years ago, the Architectural Heritage Fund secured some funding as part of the wider Future High Streets programme, and what they decided to do with that programme was to pilot the idea of these heritage development trusts. So it's one way of describing it for those that are familiar with the Building Preservation Trust model is it's kind of putting them on steroids and turning them into something just a little bit more energetic and a little bit more impactful and a little bit better resourced, and just kind of allowing them to do more and better. So Valley Heritage were fortunate enough to go through the competitive process of securing that funding, and we were the 4th of 3, and I know that doesn't make any sense. AHF were only going to fund 3 HDTs in this pilot, and somehow or other they scraped at the back of the sofa and found a bit of money to give to us and include us in the pilot, which we're immensely grateful for. The impact of that has been absolutely enormous. Really simple things. So because this is a funded project where we get core funding as part of the arrangement, we don't have to scrape around for core costs like insurance and simple things like that anymore. And it means that we can focus all of our efforts on taking forward amazing projects and supporting our community to sustain these brilliant heritage buildings that we were surrounded by. It's also done things like, there's a really strong peer group as part of it. That's something that's broadening all the time through Heritage Trust Network that I'll touch on maybe towards the end, where the group of organisations that are part of this pilot come together quarterly, share experience, share learning, share knowledge, have a chat, sympathise with each other when things aren't going so well, and for Valley Heritage as the baby of the family, if you like, we get the benefit of organisations like Great Yarmouth, who've been doing it for donkey's years and are brilliant at it, seen it, done it, got a t-shirt. We get all of that knowledge, and it is incredibly helpful, and it's brilliantly inspirational to see what the idea of HDT can actually achieve. I think, I guess the other thing with that is that that resource and capacity that we've been able to build has allowed us to move forward at a greater pace, and we've seen that we can be more impactful as an organisation from where we were only a couple of years ago. So it's a big thing. The Heritage Trust Network bit of it, it's not on the slide, but I think it's kind of an important thing to say. Heritage Trust Network are an organisation that is kind of represents heritage-owning organisations in the broadest sense of it. And they're very keen to support this idea of heritage development trusts and expand the peer learning that they already do, the peer-to-peer networking, to make sure that the HDTs that exist both within the pilot that AHF are funding and more broadly that kind of exist anyway, can all share learning more widely and network more widely and mutually support each other more widely. So Heritage Trust Network are kind of a really important part of the infrastructure of this kind of heritage sector, building preservation trusts, heritage development trusts. So projects. Valley Heritage have been involved in quite a few projects, and the first of our capital projects is the former Lancashire and Yorkshire Bank in Bacup Town Centre. So brilliant little building, sort of constructed in this Scottish baronial style, so it's quite a gothic-y, quite a romantic looking building in many respects. And it sat there right in the middle of Bacup Town Centre, quite a prominent location. It's Grade 2 listed, it was. We got the opportunity to acquire it. That in itself is quite a long story, but we got there in the end after some negotiating with a private owner who had allowed the building to kind of fall into disrepair, and a little bit of support from our local authority in kind of pushing the owner in our direction. It was an incredibly poor use at the time we acquired it. In fact, it was so poor that the council had prohibited the use of it about a year earlier. Show the next one. So hopefully that image will illustrate what it was like. So the building had been converted into 7 bedsits. So if you think student accommodation, but grottier. And the individuals it was let to, basically the business model of the owner was to let the building to individuals who were receiving housing benefit, who had significant social needs, but not support those individuals with those social needs. So it led to a building that became a hive of antisocial behaviour. So there was drug abuse, alcohol abuse, prostitution, all taking place from this building, which was conveniently located a few yards from the local pub, and all that antisocial behaviour started to breed with the pub and just exploded in the town centre, became really problematic, so the council just basically shut the building down. The owners basically didn't have an idea what to do with it at that point. They had no income stream anymore, so they decided to sell, and that's where we came in. So in terms of what we're doing with that building, it's on site at the moment. I'll show you a few photographs of how that's progressing in a little while. We did, sometimes with this kind of organisation, you have to be quite opportunistic. And that means sometimes you try and buy a building without completely having thought through the plan, which is kind of what we had to do here, because we had to react to the owner choosing to sell and giving us a window of opportunity to deal with it. So in that window of opportunity, we did a lot of the work that Annoushka was talking about earlier in terms of project viability studies and developing what the scheme should look like. And we, having done a little bit of market research, having spoken to stakeholders and understood our local environment as we do, we looked at co-working space and changing the apartment model that was in there so that they were proper one-bedroom apartments that have a kind of a quality to them. And the funding mix around that is quite complex. So we've got Architectural Heritage Fund loan, which we use to purchase the building. We've got Architectural Heritage Fund grant, which is being used to refurbish the building alongside National Lottery Heritage Fund. Who else? I have to look at the slide to remember now. High Street Heritage Action Zone is in the mix as well. And just to make it really awkward, High Street Heritage Action Zone and AHF's grants come from the same source. And that means you can't match fund them to each other. So we've literally had to run 2 separate construction contracts at the same time with the same contractor to make that funding mix work. So sometimes you have to do some gymnastics to get these projects to work. So this is the interior of the co-working space, a sort of an artist's impression. So the idea here is that we want all of our projects to have social outcomes as well as supporting the retention and reuse of heritage. So co-working spaces in town centres like Bacup are a fantastic potential resource because it's a town full of kind of people who either commute out, and if we can remove a few journeys, get people a bit more engaged in their town centre, have them spending locally, all of those kind of things have big benefits. And then the other side of it is it's also a town with lots of entrepreneurs tending to be kind of freelancers, sole traders, often working in quite isolated conditions. So by having a space which is relatively cheap to access, they can come into that space and work in a more sociable environment that removes some of that isolation and loneliness. So those are some of our drivers for creating that co-working space. It'll have 10 desks, meeting rooms, kind of 24/7 access, and work on a membership-based model where you can become a member. There are certain benefits to that membership, and depending on how many desk days you buy over the course of a month, it gets a little bit cheaper the more you buy. And that's kind of long and short of that model. And this is one of the apartments. Again, little artist's impression. So there are 4 of these going into the building. 2 of them will be for market rent, and 2 of them will working in partnership with a charity called M3 Project that operates locally to us in Rosendale. And their role is that they support young people at risk of homelessness. So young people who might have had a massive fallout with their parents and be sleeping on the friend's sofa, or a pregnancy that has led to problems at home, and they might be struggling to have a kind of permanent place that they can call home. So M3 Project support those people and put them into more permanent accommodation. Younger people, they put them with other families and create a stable environment that way. For slightly older people, maybe towards 17, 18, they will try and place them into accommodation like what we're going to provide. So a really nice, high-quality, one-bedroom apartment that they can call home for as long as they need to. And M3 Project will support them in terms of getting them back on the feet, helping them to manage their day-to-day lives, looking at employment opportunities, all that kind of thing. So as a model, the idea of working to repurpose heritage assets to support people with real social needs is very, very attractive to us. And it's something that we're hoping, if it works here at the Lancashire and Yorkshire Bank, we'll be able to do again with the same partnership and looking at other properties across our area. So the apartments, we're trying to make them as sustainable as we can. Heritage assets aren't always the easiest buildings to deal with from a sustainability point of view, but one of the things we've been able to do is look at putting air source heat pumps in for the heating and hot water. And we've been fortunate enough to get some other project funding separate to this, which will allow us to really evaluate how that works and work with the users, understand how they're finding it and disseminate that information. And hopefully there'll be positive experiences that will lead more people to look at these kind of technologies on heritage assets. So a few photos just to show how we're going. One of our big challenges is that it's quite a landlocked site. The yard is tiny. I'm still not quite sure where we've got to put the bins. But it's a building that's full of character. And the the carvings on it in particular are fantastic, really characterful things. There's actually an art project going on separately to this that is drawing on the gargoyles that are dotted around the town, including on the Lancashire Yorkshire bank, and bringing them to life through animation, which is going to be really good fun. And this was taken about 3 weeks ago, I think. So yeah, the scaffold is just about starting to come down now, and we're due to open hopefully by mid-April with the following wind. This is one of the internal spaces sort of through the course of refurbishment, still a long way to go at that point. And one of the internal rooms in the apartments, showing all the petitioning going up. One of the things I thought it would be helpful to talk about is just to build on what Annoushka was saying about funding, and it's really interesting at the moment, the funding climate, because it's gone from being quite lean pre-pandemic to there being lots and lots of interesting funding opportunities out there. It doesn't necessarily make them any easier to access, but there's money around. And I just thought that's a list which, you know, having seen the Annoushka slide, I've missed loads off of potential funders. These are perhaps the more heritage and town centre focused ones. But there's some really interesting ones starting to come about. So the UK Shared Prosperity Fund is due to be released sometime later this year, and that is the replacement for EU structural funds. And EU structural funds have been used by lots of heritage-focused organisations to bring assets forward, and the hope is that UK Shared Prosperity Fund will be another financial instrument that can be used by organisations like ours, and I think is a really interesting opportunity. And then just thinking again about funding, this is, I guess, a little bit sort of lessons learned in a way. Valley Heritage has been around for about 7 years, and when we set off, we were ambitious, to say the least. As an architect, in my professional life, I deal with quite significant projects on a day-to-day basis, so I made the very misguided assumption that I could be the chair of a charity and all that experience would carry weight with funders and stakeholders. It doesn't, unfortunately. You need to build track record, and what we learned is that you know, going for that big project as the first one is hard, really, really hard. Annoushka is one of the few people I know who's made it work, and I don't quite know how she's done it, to be honest, but I'm sure there's lots of lessons to learn there. What we learned is that it's a more straightforward path to start small, build some track record, and work your way up to that capital project. And it can all be targeted in the same direction, but building that relationship with funders in particular, building credibility with your stakeholders is really, really important in the formative stages of these kind of organisations. And I think that's probably the key lesson I've learned in the journey I've been on with Valley Heritage, that I think is helpful to share. Other kind of things to think about is that there is funding out there for start-up activities. NLHF and AHF both fund that kind of thing. So, you know, getting the organisation set up, recruiting trustees, getting a business plan together, making sure your governance is robust from the outset. There's funding out there to do that kind of thing, and it's really helpful to get that support in at an early stage and set off on the right foot. Governance in particular can get a little bit tricky, and more from the point of view that you get so far along the road and you realise that actually the governance isn't quite doing what you need it to do, and it's a bit awkward to change when you get to that point. Start it right and it's much, much easier. And I think the other thing I would just leave you with, alongside this slide, I always like to finish on a slightly moody image, but that idea of being agile, it's been the great strength of Valley Heritage, I think, has been its agility and its ability to pivot to opportunities when those opportunities have come up. So that funding that I talked about in terms of evaluating the air source heat pumps at the Lancashire Yorkshire Bank, that was an opportunity we identified, and myself and one of my fellow trustees spent a chunk of the weekend pulling together a bid and got £250,000 worth of mostly revenue funding from that bid. And just that ability to jump on it and get it done and get it out the door has led to a really important success for us as an organisation. And I think that's probably the thing that I will leave you with and hand you over to our next speaker. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Dawson. I'm one of the trustees of Save Grange Lido. We're a community benefit society, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about our project and the work we do. But first of all, I'll start with the thing we're always asked, which is whether it is Lido as in Speedo, Lido as in Fido, or for those of you who grew up around here like me, Grange Baths. Begin with some history. In the 1930s, there was a huge trend for fresh air, sun, and seaside. And during that decade, 180 outdoor pools were built throughout the UK, and Grange was one of them. Construction was in 1932, and we found some old photographs of the construction. You can see here the seawall, the seawall being constructed. 1932, that building cost £17,000 to construct. We'd be laughing if it was £17,000 now, because it would have been opened about 10 years ago. But anyway, the designer was a chap called Thomas Huddleston, who also worked on the designs for Grange Promenade. He wanted the Lido... Sorry, I'm going to bend over and keep flicking my mouse, I do apologise. He wanted the Lido to be the focal point of the journey along the prom. And his architecture at the time drew on the designs for sports stadia. And so you have the pool at the centre with the benches and the buildings all wrapping around and focusing on it, drawing your eyes to the distinctly Art Deco benches and the diving platform. It's a very symmetrical view. Your eye is led to that diving platform and the tremendous view across Morecambe Bay. Huddleston designed it to look like the stern of an ocean liner when you're seeing it from the bay itself. And just diverting here a little bit, we're doing a cross-bay walk in August, and you'll be able to see that view for yourself if you join us on that walk. The pool was unheated and filled with seawater, and the tanks that collected the seawater were underneath the terraces. The opening ceremony was on August the 18th, 1932. A tremendously big event. Huge crowds, dignitaries from across the northwest. It was a day full of events and displays, and they had a gala ball at the Grange Hotel, which went on until 2:30 a.m. the next day. I think they knew how to party in the early 1930s. Amongst the guests were the Windsor Water Bullies, undoubtedly the most attractive swimwear that's ever been offered to a discriminating public. I think I'll reserve judgment on that. There was also a mangle on the poolside, so you could bring out your costume after your swim. It was a really popular attraction. It was the focal point of Grange setting itself up as a tourist attraction. Currently we're working with a couple of interns from Lancaster University, and one of them found a tourist brochure about Grange in the university library. And that brochure runs to about 70 pages, and on most pages there is reference to Grange Baths being an incredible attraction for the town. It also tells us that the admission price in the 1930s was 6 old pence, or 2.5p. Moving on to the 50s and 60s, it remained very popular. Research by one of our team found that one 15-week season in the 1960s, the pool attracted 60,000 visitors. However, during the 1960s, seaside Lidos began to disappear. The northwest coast lost several, and we lost obviously the one at Bigger Bank that many of you will remember. Blackpool, Morecambe, Lytham, Southport and 2 on the Wirral were all demolished from 1960 onwards. Grange survived, Just a little aside, the railings you can see on this picture and along the top of the seawall were all replaced with rather ugly modern railings and a brick wall in the 70s. And one of our ambitions is to try and restore those railings with something more in keeping with the heritage of the site. Also, you can see that the diving platform has a very high board that I think is about 16 or 17 feet high, diving into 9 feet of water. Not surprisingly, that was stopped in the late 70s or early 80s, and they put a great big concrete block on the top of it to stop people diving from it. That'll appear on some pictures later. From the 1970s, package holidays began to become cheaper and more readily available, and attendances declined. There were also some severe maintenance issues. There was a flood caused by a high tide in the late 1970s that caused significant damage. Although there were 50th and 60th anniversary galas in 82 and 92, it didn't last much long after that. Amongst the bits and pieces we found on site is this programme from 1993, the final year the pool was open. The opening hours were 11 to 5:30. Adult swimming prices were £2.40, but if the water temperature was below 18 degrees, that reduced to £1.70. It closed in 1993 and has remained closed ever since. We're told that it was closed because the pool was losing 12,000 gallons of water a day, and that the repairs carried out in the 1970s had reached the end of their useful life, and SLDC, who owned the site, couldn't afford to repair it. It's a story we've been told, but we don't know how true it is, but apparently that chap turned up for his morning swim on the day of closure and found the doors locked. You can see the block I mentioned on top of the diving platform on that image. It was abandoned suddenly. The furniture's still there are bits and pieces everywhere. It looks like a crime scene, and some of you might remember that some scenes from the first series of The Bay were filmed there a couple of years ago. Incidentally, ITV only paid 1,500 quid to use the Lido for 2 days. I think that's very cheap. There are bits and pieces left everywhere. A lot of you will recognise those. After closure, a lot of people in Grange really wanted to have a pool, and volunteers tried to raise money to secure a new facility. They obtained a grant from Sport England, and the Burners Close pool was built and opened in 2003. It was 10 years since the Lido had closed, but unfortunately this pool was beset with problems, both in terms of construction and management. It closed in 2006 and was demolished in 2013. This means that Grange had the dubious distinction of having 2 derelict pools within a quarter of a mile of each other for a period of 7 years. Our feeling is that if it hadn't been for the Burners Close problems, the Lido would be much further along the way to restoration. One of the issues is that a lot of local people donated a lot of money to the Burners pool, and obviously they didn't see anything for their donations, and so there was a bit of a reluctance on their part to support the restoration of the outdoor pool. So where do we fit in? We began in 2011 as a small volunteer group of about half a dozen people who got together when plans were put forward to redevelop the whole site, which would have lost the Lido forever. Thanks to the efforts of those volunteers, the Lido became Grade 2 listed. And the listing is for these reasons. It's a complete example of a 1930s Lido. It's got an unusual mushroom-shaped pool, and one of the most important heritage aspects is the historic one. It's an evocative reminder of the popularity of seaside towns like Grange and the interwar cult of fresh air, fitness and mass leisure. Over the next 7 years, from 2011, South Lakeland District Council carried out a number of consultations and studies In 2017, they put a final consultation out for Grange residents, asking them what they wanted to happen for the pool and giving them various options, such as crazy golf, children's play areas, etc. But none of the options in that consultation included a swimming pool. It's bizarre. But because of the results of that consultation, SLDC decided to go ahead with what they call a light touch renovation, which would have meant the pool being filled in. That prompted the growth of SGL. As I said, it began in 2011 with about half a dozen people. In late 2018, the number of volunteers had grown to about 40, and all from different backgrounds. We decided that one way to put pressure on with SLDC to encourage them to think more positively about the pool would be to launch petitions asking them not to fill in the pool. And our petition secured 18,000 signatures, and that prompted SLDC to begin to sit down with us and talk to us about the future of the site. Must confess, the first meeting was a bit strange. We all sat around the table growling at each other. In my working life, I was a solicitor, and I think I even threatened them with judicial review at one point during that first meeting. But since then, we've developed a very good working relationship and partnership with the council, and we are now working closely with them to ensure the success of the project. We're a community benefit society. Why have we done that? Well, first of all, it's a member society, rather like a co-op. We're structured in such a way as to have a board of trustees with 9 trustees, all from different backgrounds. For instance, one of our trustees is a chap called Ralph Riley, who is one of the world's leading experts on swimming pool water quality. You may remember at the Rio Olympics when the diving pool water turned green, Ralph was called in to help them fix that. So that's how respected he is. We have heritage architects. We've got a former cabinet minister involved with us as well, Hazel Blears, who now lives in Grange. And we're very much focused on being a community members society. We have charitable objectives, which means that on our donations we can collect gift aid. But the most important aspect of being a community benefit society is the community share issue, which is something we can use when we're into major fundraising, and which we hope will bring us a large sum of money to help us toward the capital cost. By way of example, the Jubilee Pool in Penzance is a community benefit society. It undertook a community share issue to fund its geothermal programme a couple of years ago and raised £600,000 from 1,500 people, I think. Where the project is now, SLDC secured planning permission for what's now called Phase 1 2 years ago this month. That is to enable them to do essential structural repairs to the sea defences and terracing, and originally to all the ancillary buildings. Obviously, COVID then struck, and the pandemic has had a significant impact on progress. SLDC put the work out to tender in July 2020. They had a budget then of £2 million, and the tenders came in at over £4 million. So they put their thinking caps on and decided to scale down the scheme a little bit, and they've omitted now work on the 2 ancillary pavilions and the dining platform. They then re-tendered it. They still came in over budget, but this time by only £800,000. And thankfully, rather than SLDC's putting the Lido project into the too difficult pile, they agreed last March to fund the extra £800,000 from reserves, so they're now paying £2.8 million on the Phase 1 work. The work was due to begin late last year, but there are a couple of issues with the planning conditions that are attached that still need to be resolved, so but we're expecting their work to begin in the spring, taking probably 18 months, maybe 2 years. We hope that at the end of that period we'll be ready to go ahead with our work. SLDC is cooperating with us fully. They have amended their plans so that it dovetails with what we want to do and we don't have to rip things out that they've put in. They agree that it's a two-phase project and they're helping us with grant funding. But of course we've got local government reorganisation to contend with, so from the fairly near future we'll have a different bunch of councils and officers to deal with possibly, but we are aware of that and we're working on how best to deal with it. Phase 2, this is our part of the work. What's going to happen at the end of Phase 1 is that we will be granted a lease from SLDC at peppercorn rent. If we're ready to go ahead with Phase 2 when they've finished, we'll go straight in and do it. But if not, we will run the site as a community and heritage centre while we raise the rest of the money to fit out the pool. It's not an ideal situation, but it's a means to an end. What we're going to have is a 50-metre swimming pool. We're the only 50-metre swimming pool in Cumbria. It will be suitable for county-level competition. We don't aim to have higher level competition than that. We're building 2 side extensions to the central pavilion. Oops, sorry, it usually works, but it doesn't work very well. 2 side extensions which will house admin areas, a changing places facility for the disabled. The first floor of the main building will be a cafe restaurant with views across the pool and out over the bay. There will be a gym and on the first floor of the smaller building you can see there, and a community space on the first floor of the other small pavilion. The pool won't have seawater because the tidal changes are such that we can't get the seawater to it, so it's going to be fresh water. But we are confident that we can use geothermal heating to take the edge off it, not to bring it up to 25 degrees, but maybe 18, 20 degrees. We've had help from the people at Lido North on that part of our work. Part of showing people that we are serious and a bunch of volunteers who can deliver such a big project involved us preparing a business plan. And SLDC paid for that plan to be independently assessed by an expert from the leisure industry. And he said that our plans were sustainable and viable. On the figures that we did pre-COVID, we're showing an accumulated surplus of about £250,000 after 5 years, but obviously the figures will need to be adjusted to take account of rising energy costs. I also think that the admission prices we put in then are too low, so there'll be a way around to combat any increased energy costs. But the key figures from the independent review are that we'll create 15 full-time equivalent jobs. We'll have £110,000 benefit to the local supply chain, and those big numbers, over £8 million in health benefits and £5 million in well-being benefits. That £13 million is almost double the capital cost of the project, so the benefits are plain to be seen. We think it's more than just a swimming pool without a roof. If it was just a swimming pool, I think probably half of our volunteers wouldn't be terribly interested. We see it as a building that will tell a story about heritage. Heritage isn't just about buildings, but it's about people's memories and recollections. The Lido was built when people hoped to experience more leisure time, and our heritage will focus on the stories we've been told, which include stories of people going onto the top of the diving platform and jumping not into the pool, but into the sea at high tide. And also a story from, who was it, district councillor told us that his father visited during pre-war years and went off the top of the diving platform in a Lido, which exploded on impact with the water. He wasn't injured, so that's fine. We think that this will be an iconic destination. It fits in with the work Eden North and the Winter Gardens doing in Morecambe, with the work being done at Ernsey Bay, and it'll transform the bay as a destination for many people. We have support from many organisations. I mentioned Eden North, we meet with them regularly, and have even offered us an idea whereby there would be joint ticketing to both venues. We have support from the National Trust, Cumbria Tourism, Morecambe Bay Partnership, the list goes on. Lots of uses for the Lido as well, other than swimming. We could do corporate away days, we have catering. Simon Rogan's been interested in running pop-ups there. And outdoor cinema operators are quite keen to use it as well. So, in the water, watch Jaws on a Lido. There you go. We need to raise about £4 million on top of SLDC's 2.8. We began fundraising in November 2018. We have merchandise, we have a Friends scheme, which has over 300 members, and we receive over £10,000 a year plus gift aid from that scheme. We've had grants that I'll talk about in a moment. And of course, there is the community share issue that I've mentioned. And so far, we've raised over £120,000. We haven't yet gone to individual donors and philanthropists for big sums of money, because at the moment, we have nothing to sell them. We have no bricks and mortar yet. We're still in the development stage, but we will be at that point, probably later in the year, when we're expecting to do the community share issue. The grants received, thanks to Annoushka, we've had a project development grant of £6,200, a project liability grant of £6,200. We are working through the second project development grant of £15,000 with architects and pool engineers finalising our plans ready for a planning application. We had a grant in 2019 from the NLHF, £9,900 for capacity and engagement, and used that to host a series of open days at the Lido where we were able to show people around, tell them what we wanted to do with the site and explain our project to them. Just before COVID, we had an expression of interest accepted by the National Lottery for the full funding, but because of COVID they changed their requirements for that funding and the expression of interest had to be withdrawn, so we're back to the drawing board with that, but we hope to submit another one in the spring of this year. We've also got merchandise. The image on the left is by our Treasurer's daughter, and the image on the right is an old Frank Sherwin railway poster. A lady in Kent's Bank owns an original of that, and she kindly let us borrow it and take it to a large flatbed scanner in Nottingham to get a high-res image that we could use for printing. And we can now print it up to A2. And the original poster, again, the lady in Kent's Bank, loaned it to the Victorian Albert for an exhibition about Lidos just before the pandemic. I think she's got it back. So before I finish, I want to tell you why Grange Lido is important. These three pools, Tinside, Jubilee and Saltdean, they're all on the south coast. They're the other three seaside Lidos in England. Grange is the fourth one, and Grange is the only one that isn't open. But it will be. Thank you.
Right, okay, thank you very much for that, David. So I'm just going to finish off with essentially our vision for a Heritage Development Trust in Barrow and South Cumbria. I hope that there's been a lot of informative talks tonight. And it's really how we can learn from other people and put that into practice. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, it will take a long time, but I hope that people can be as passionate about heritage as I am, and we can look at putting together a board of trustees who can take this vision forward. So, a mission statement. Working creatively to rescue the identity of Barrow and South Cumbria's built heritage and secure its future. With some objectives as well. Work with the local arts community organisations, local councils to realise new uses for vacant heritage buildings. Working with local colleges and educational establishments to increase heritage knowledge and skills, which I think that's massively important. education around heritage, appreciation of heritage from the younger generation is something that, you know, is really important to develop that knowledge in the area. Curate and celebrate the unique character and history of South Cumbria, from Barrow, very industrial town, to Kendal, very rural, and you know, sort of epitome of the lakes. There's such a wide variety of vernacular in South Cumbria, and championing adaptive reuse as a priority to reduce carbon emissions in the construction sector. Obviously, reusing a heritage building where it's already got the embodied carbon rather than throwing up a new concrete structure. I think that that's something that, you know, heritage can help to address climate change. Next, please. So there's a lot of specific local problems in South Cumbria. Professional skills, there's only one conservation accredited structural engineer, no conservation accredited quantity surveyors, and only 3 AABC, that's architects accredited in building conservation, and 3 REBA conservation practices. We do have a couple of people here tonight who are from just outside of Cumbria, so they're not included in those figures. Trade skills, there's no big main contractors who've got heritage experience. There's a handful of smaller builders who can take on heritage jobs and know the traditional skills and materials. Very locally, up to my knowledge, there's only one stonemason and stained glass glazier, and we've got a few competent joiners, but they're on sort of long lead times. And if you move further into Cumbria or Lancashire, then there are more people. The general public, because of lack of education, don't know about the sort of traditional skills and materials, and the lack of that trade knowledge. It'll generally be a builder turning up who's used to using modern materials, damp proofing, which can have adverse impacts on heritage buildings. And the geographic location, we are the longest cul-de-sac in England, famously in Barrow, and the sort of student talent moves away, and it's difficult to get them to come back. And any tradesmen that we do want to get in to carry out works, if they're coming from further afield, the prices will be inflated because of travel and accommodation. So what can a Heritage Development Trust do? Skip to the next slide. I think that we'll skip this because we've covered quite a lot of it. That was going to be a video from Derbyshire Historic Buildings Trust talking about what they do. One example of their smaller projects is that they acquired a building in the conservation area of Long Row in Belper. Essentially the street was full of a lot of buildings with UPVC windows and features that were unsympathetic, and they basically took on one of these buildings, refurbed it with original replica features, and opened up the house to have an exhibition of this is how much a timber window costs, this is how much UPVC costs, these are the pros and cons, etc. And that became a catalyst for the rest of the street being regenerated using traditional methods. The Great Yarmouth Preservation Trust, another example which Annoushka touched on very briefly earlier. They're actually part of set up by the local council, the local authority there, and they've taken on a couple of towers that are part of the city wall and done them up, and they rent them out as Airbnbs. Another notable organisation who I'd like to mention, the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings. So they're a fantastic national organisation, and as I mentioned earlier, I think that sort of training in heritage skills is really important, and so they run annual working parties to allow lay people to go and get hands-on with things like lime water, joinery, things like that. And the Northwest branch are relatively active. And before COVID, we're looking at doing a working party at Gleeson Castle, but I believe that there has been a little more collapse there. So, but it may be something that we could tie into. So, this sort of information and what you've heard from other speakers tonight, how can it translate to Barrow? So, you know, there are buildings in the town where there's a lot of public thoughts about, you know, why can't the council do something about that? And having an organisation like a Heritage Development Trust, they would be a safe pair of hands that councils could pass buildings onto if they were able to take ownership of them. Working with building owners to run working parties, so if a building owner wasn't necessarily able to gift their property, you might be able to work with them to open it up and provide education opportunities and capacity building. We could work to campaign to save the buildings at risk. Establishing, empowering other community groups to focus on individual buildings, or linking existing community groups who are looking for spaces with suitable vacant buildings, helping with the grant application, and then acquisition loans through people like the Architectural Heritage Fund if the Heritage Development Trust wanted to take on a building themselves. And it's about creative reuse. I think a lot of the time a building will be vacant and people just think, oh well, that could be a house, and then it falls out of public use, and you know the public don't get to appreciate it. So St Michael's and St Matthew's churches in Dendron and Ramside, you know, they've recently closed to the public. They're sort of open on very infrequently, but you know, examples of what they could be in the future. Things like climbing centres, skate parks, cycle cafes. It's all of these creative uses which could help to bring people back to them, and so they can appreciate the heritage whilst undertaking different activities. So the Derbyshire Historic Buildings Trust that I mentioned earlier, and their example on Long Row in Belper, is there an opportunity to take on a smaller building within Barrow and use that as a catalyst? So we've got Dominion Street there on the left, Salthouse cottages on the right, and then the photos as they are relatively recently. Taken from Street View, not my own personal photos. And you know, whether there could be a catalyst to show people actually this is the correct way to do things with a heritage building. Yeah, improve, you know, damp conditions inside because there's been a cement render on the building, etc. And you know, sort of showcase that it can be affordable, and like I say, the pros and cons of using traditional methods and materials. And I've put this one in for Jake at the front here. So a former steward at the town hall, he's got this great idea that we could have a replica submarine as a museum piece in the town. It's what we're famous for, and you know, crude Photoshop mock-up there, but it's not necessarily a heritage building, but it's heritage, and as David said, heritage isn't necessarily just about the buildings, it's about the memories, the stories, identity, and you know, imagine sort of the tourists in the Lake District and the possibility we could get them to tear them away and come down to Barrow for a day and have a look around a replica submarine. I think that would be fantastic. And yeah, so that's a whistle-stop tour. I wanted to get to the Q&A, so ran through that rather quickly. But if anybody has any questions, if anybody would like to get involved, you can email me at rwood@barrowbc.gov.uk, and I think that we'll wrap up with a panel Q&A now. So if everyone would like to take their seats. Rachel has got a microphone. Oh, Maddie's got the microphone. So if anybody has any questions, raise your hand and...
Yeah, I've got one more.
Just hold this quite close like that.
Going back to this submarine project thing, right, which is an ongoing process since 2004. One of the proposals years ago was having a building. What I'd like to know is what buildings are available, possibly close to the yard, not necessarily next to the museum, but with a waterfront. For eventual future, to get a proper submarine here next to it. But I've been listening to what the talkers have been speaking about, and starting small and everything else. One of my ideas was coming down from Morrison's. We have an old railway office. I don't know who it belongs to, but that was in that proposal in 2004 to start off in that small place there. And I've looked, just driving past there tonight, I've looked at the other side of the scrapyards and all sorts around the area, which could be prettied up a little bit. We need that opposite St George's Square, near the cottages you just mentioned. So the question, and that's gone a long way around, is do you know what buildings are available or should be reheritaged?
Well, I think that the talks that we've had tonight sort of exemplify that no building is really too far gone to be saved, and that there are creative uses. I mean, if you look at Derbyshire Historic Buildings Trust, their website, they've got a lot of projects going on at the same time, and a lot of it is about the right building at the right time, and it just depends on, can ownership be gifted, can it be transferred to the council by one way or another to then be handed on, what specific buildings are available in the town with a waterfront. I don't know the specific building that you've talked about. I know that the land registry plan for that, it doesn't actually extend to the waterfront. So there would be other acquisitions that would be required as well as that building. So, I mean, it's something that we could definitely look into if you wanted to come on board.
Yeah, I think it's a listed building.
It is, yes.
Yes, so so they can't rip it down like a lot of places have been doing. It's worth looking at, I think, for the future. Before I go any further, I'll see what's available. But as regards that submarine, of course, they did have a real submarine here in Barrow maybe 10 years ago or less than that. One of the problems with having it near the museum was they couldn't afford to dredge the facilities to take it into the dry dock at the museum, which would be great, but it would just cost far too much at the moment.
I mean, I don't know if other people on the panel can sort of provide answers to that around funding. I mean, my sort of initial thoughts would be that the funding wouldn't necessarily come from the council, the Dock Museum, to do that. It would be through other mechanisms.
Maybe answer one of his questions. Looking at properties, well, a decade or so ago, we actually managed to get a list from Furnace Enterprise. So they had a list of all buildings that were available, including council buildings. So for prospective new businesses coming into the town, they could either take a ready-made building, readily available building, or a particular site that was disused. So that could be the first protocol to find out what they've got on the listing.
Okay.
Yeah. I've got lots of other questions, but I think I need my brain to digest it all.
To all three speakers, I mean, renovating any historic building, heritage building project takes forever. How do you keep momentum going on these types of projects?
So I'll talk about Stretford Public Hall for this, because that's a project that we started looking at in about 2014, and it's still going. It took us 2 years to get into the building, which is quite quick. But it was already in an all right state. But what we found worked was having lots of stepping stones so that people could have an idea and see that we were moving along a path that kept people's engagement. We made sure that we gave out tasks to people. We got people doing things and getting them to use their skills, because no one person's going to have all the skills all the time to do everything that's needed, and that was a big project. And that made people feel like they were doing something important, which they were, and being part of it. Be it from some kids delivering leaflets to the people designing the leaflets. So everyone got involved in lots of different ways. And then once we got into the building, it was phasing it. So we did small parts of the building in steps, and having meanwhile uses in those parts of the building that weren't necessarily going to be the end use of the building. And it was a good opportunity to try things out, let people run wild, because you quite often get people saying, oh, I want to do this, and you're like, oh, no. And then actually, no, go on, try it. And quite often these things end up being the most popular things that, give people that sort of space to try things, and that keeps momentum going, keeps interest going.
The Lancashire and Yorkshire Bank, it's about as quick as it happens. We've been told it's rapid, the pace of that project. So we acquired in 2019. At the end of 2019, we probably had 6 months in the build-up to that, dealing with the loan application and the owner. And here we are on site in early 2022 and due to complete in the next couple of months. I reckon we could have done it a year quicker if a few things had gone our way. Just funding decisions and the like, but actually I'm quite glad it didn't, because just look what we would have been dealing with a year ago. We would have been under a working from home directive, which would have prevented the space being used. So sometimes that time actually helps. It's quite a sharp example, but projects like this do need a gestation period, and they need a little bit of time to kind of think it through. And when quite a lot of it relies on volunteer effort, it's not as if people are spending a full working week dealing with these projects and thinking them through. It's a couple of hours here and there over a weekend, and that kind of elongates the process as well, quite naturally. In terms of kind of keeping people interested, what Annoushka said about kind of small milestones, lots of little successes, really, really important. Seeing other people's success is helpful. I mean, I talked about Heritage Trust Network before. They run a conference every year, and it's like it's one of the most cathartic experiences you can have. Just getting drunk with fellow BPT people and just sharing those experiences and the joy and the pain of it is brilliant, and it gets you through the next year of the same joy and pain and the kind of roller coaster that it can sometimes be. I'm not selling this, am I? But ultimately, Annoushka's experiencing it, I'm experiencing it, and David, isn't it? David's experiencing it. You kind of have these incredible successes where, as a small group of usually volunteers, you've achieved something actually quite amazing. That is huge, not only on a personal level, but for the community that you're in, and that success makes you want to do it again and again and again, and that's the thing that I think probably motivates me in the end.
Can I just chip in and say one of the issues we've had is that in 2018, 2019, we were campaigning, and lots of our volunteers loved the campaign, they loved the aggression of it, and they loved shouting at people. But we've had to change from being a campaigning group to being a delivery organisation. And obviously some volunteers who don't want to get involved in the nitty-gritty of form filling and applying for grants have drifted away, but other people have come on board because that's the stuff they like. And one thing we try to do is encourage volunteers to complete a skills questionnaire for us and ask them how much time they can give and what areas of our work interest them, so that we can try to spread the load and ensure that they're doing things that they like. But as was just said, small victories. One of the biggest achievements I think we've had, it sounds very tiny when I tell you what it is, but from an organisation which South Deighton District Council really didn't want to deal with for many years, we've got to the point where we now hold a set of keys to the Lido. And I think that's a tremendous leap of faith by the council. And that really encouraged our volunteers. And we have regular meetings, we send out newsletters, we just try to keep them engaged all the time and ask for ideas. The lady who does our merchandise prints all the stuff at home, and she loves doing it, and she loves organising things like open days that are held at the Victoria Hall in Grange. So each to their own. I do the paperwork, I'm a lawyer.
You've got to see can't be both, it's beautiful.
Yes. Thank you.
In terms of the proposals for a Barrow and South Cumbria Trust, is that looking to focus on places like Dawson, Askham as well? And in terms of the next 15 months, you're going to be Westmoreland and Furness. Have you got some indication of whether the trust should cover the whole of the new district? Secondly, do you have an idea of the number of buildings that are at risk in the area? And lastly, in terms of the trust's proposed work, do you see it dealing with the Abbey Road Working Men's Club site, or do you regard that as being something as a redevelopment opportunity?
This is all quite, early stages. I mean, the idea of developing this sort of organisation has been something that I've wanted to do before I even joined the council in my current role. I grew up in Barrow, became an architect because I thought that I could come back and save Barrow's heritage, a romantic idea, and then this job came up and it was, a dream job opportunity. And so off the back of this, being able to set up such an organisation, with local people behind it, and because I'm from Barrow, I have spoken about Barrow buildings, but absolutely it would take on other buildings in South Cumbria and other towns and areas. Because it's early stages, there isn't a defined area. That would be something that if we could get some interested people on board and perhaps set up a board of trustees, that those details could be agreed in the early stages. But right now it's a concept, and it's something to build on. Oh, sorry, I didn't answer the query about House of Lords. So through the Heritage Action Zone, that is one of the buildings that is within the Heritage Action Zone. A feasibility study has been undertaken on the building. There's been a bit of back and forth with the owner about that, cooperation, non-cooperation. So we're just in the final stages of that feasibility study now. What that means for the council or an organisation like a Building Preservation Trust, a Heritage Development Trust, unsure. If a board of members could be formed, and if they could provide a stance on that building, and if they would want to get involved with that building. It is in private ownership at the moment, and there could be talks with the owner, there could be talks with the council. There's a lot of options there.
Just a question that links probably into that, especially to the people that have run these projects. What is your success rate, or how do you go about dealing with the private property owners? Because I can only speak for Barrow, but a lot of ours are privately owned, not council owned. So, and I know from work I've done with town centre development, we've had shop owners who have literally let shops run into becoming basically rodent houses because they had a long-term lease. And they just let that run out because the business is gone. And we managed to contact some of the landlords at the time. A lot weren't interested. Some were shocked because they lived in London and they just bought a property cheap online. One person, the old Warren Jane shop, actually did come and do some development and actually tidy it up. So it's a case of sometimes you can get that interaction, but how successful and long term is it?
Probably a question for me, that one. Where I operate, where Valley Heritage operates, we have kind of similar challenges really, because there's very little opportunity in terms of public sector property that might come into our ownership. It is more about engaging with the private sector, and it is challenging. The things that you say about property changing hands at auction without anyone having looked at it. They realise they've bought something that's just a money pit, and then they just don't do anything about it, because obviously if they own it for a long time it must accumulate in value despite the fact they've not maintained it. All of those issues are kind of rife where I am as well. I think the Lancashire and Yorkshire Bank perhaps points to one approach, which is where a kind of a soft interaction, a soft intervention from the local authority led to Valley Heritage being given effectively a kind of a period of time to raise the funds and to negotiate with the owner. I think the reality is that we've probably paid slightly too much for that building because of the circumstances around it and because of that engagement with the private sector. But because we're a voluntary sector organisation that aren't motivated by profit, we can make that work. And that in itself is quite helpful. I think when it comes to interactions with the private sector, I think there's really two routes. One of them is that sort of soft interaction route, where offering to take a building off a private sector owner's hands for an amount of money can work. The other way is about partnership with the local authority, and that can manifest itself in lots of ways, from the local authority supporting those kind of conversations at the softer end of the spectrum, through to local authorities that might use enforcement powers to support the change in hands of property which it sees as a priority. That end of the spectrum is difficult. Local authorities don't have the capacity and resource typically to do that kind of thing, even if they're sympathetic to the cause that sits behind it. But it's certainly, if there's an organisation that's ready to take those properties on, it's far more likely to happen. So being prepared, having that agility that I talked about earlier, becomes quite important to taking on opportunities.
And just to add, there is a sort of a legal structure that can help in some circumstances, where you can get certain buildings listed as a building of an asset of community value, and that is for things like, say, an old pub that's in the heart of that community, or an old sports venue, and you can get that listed even if it's privately owned. And that through the council, and if that gets agreed, it gives you a 6-month grace period. So if the property comes onto the market, you can either raise the funds to come up to market level, or to convince, if it's a council-owned building, to convince the council, as happened at Stretford, to not just sell the building to the highest bidder.
Okay, I think we've probably got time for one more question. Anyone else?
One for Dave.
Sorry, I've got one at the back.
If the council already owns a building, can you get grants for it?
Yes, is the really simple answer. There's a more complicated answer, but that'll take a little bit longer. I'm happy to speak to you outside, but the very simple answer is yes.
Okay, thank you. With that simple answer, we can probably squeeze in one more. I'll get this one asked and then you can ask them both.
Very simple, Dave. Have you heard of Hilsey, Lido, Lido?
Sorry?
Have you ever heard of Hilsey, Lido?
Where?
Portsmouth.
Oh yes, that's Tynshire.
Right, okay.
Yes.
That's all right.
That's the one on the BBC thing between programmes.
Yeah, I just wondered if you had to think of, I don't know if it's still open or not, but I used to obviously be in the Navy, and the fact also that Sean Connery used to use that quite often, because he was in the Navy as well. You learned to swim there.
There are lots around the country, lots of groups around the country campaigning to restore the Time Marathon in Newcastle. There's a tidal pool on the west coast of Scotland that just got some funding from the local council to investigate the opening. There is a resurgence in interest in outdoor swimming pools that we hope will bear fruit.
Rory, should we have a little bit of informal networking time for people who don't want to ask a question from the floor?
Yeah, absolutely.
Mingling time at the back?
Yeah, I mean, appreciate, people may need to go grab trains or whatnot, but yeah, we'll close the presentation there and, we'll be around for informal networking.
Thanks.